So welcome to our new study on the book of Hosea. This study we're calling The Boundless Love of God because this story talks about God's boundless love. You may not have read Hosea before. It's a minor prophet. So the last 12 books of the Old Testament are known as these minor prophets. And they begin with Hosea and end with Malachi. And they're not minor prophets because they have a less important story. They're minor because they're smaller, right? Like that's the only reason we call them minor prophets. The first of these are called Hosea, named after the prophet Hosea. And we don't know a lot about Hosea. We know that his name means salvation. But other than that, we don't know much about him as an individual. What we do know about the prophets, though, is that they do strange things, right? So for 3 years, Isaiah embarrassed people by walking the streets dressed like a prisoner of war. For several months, Jeremiah carried a yoke, like an oxen yoke, on his shoulders. The prophet Ezekiel acted like a little boy and played war, and once he used his haircut as a theological lesson. When his wife suddenly died, Ezekiel even turned that painful experience into a sermon. One prophet ate a scroll. Another prophet ate food cooked on his own feces. They do these weird things, right?
Very weird.
So weird. So why do the prophets do these peculiar things? They're really acts of mercy, right? The peculiar things themselves are presenting acts of mercy from God. So the people of God had become deaf to God's voice and stopped paying attention to the covenant or the promises that God had made. And these prophets felt called to do these strange things and hope that they would awaken people to listen to what God had to say to them before destruction, right? It's kind of, for me, it reminds me of when we say to our kids, don't jump off the coffee table, right? We're not telling them not to jump off the coffee table because we're afraid the coffee table is going to break. We're afraid our kid's going to break.
Right.
Right? So the prophets kept saying, if you keep doing this, you will be exiled, right? Babylon will come and get you. Assyria will come and get you. If you keep being stupid, bad things are going to happen. And they often talk about that as God's judgment, right? And they're offering some hope. If you change your ways, new things can happen.
Yeah.
No prophet that I know of really preached a more difficult action sermon than Hosea. He was instructed to marry a prostitute named Gomer, who subsequently bore him 3 children, who have great names, by the way. And he wasn't even sure the last 2 children were his. Then Gomer left him, her name was Gomer, the prostitute, left him to go back into prostitution. And then Hosea had the responsibility of buying back his wife a second time. So what was this all about? Right? It's this vivid picture of what the people of Israel had done to God by prostituting themselves spiritually to other gods and really kind of committing spiritual adultery. And we'll talk more about what that means later. And so that's kind of the space of this. But the truth is, we all love a good love story.
Absolutely.
Right? Romance novels are perennially on the bestseller list because everybody loves to read a love story. Movies have this, so there's a whole rom-com genre, right? Because we love these romantic comedies and romantic stories. Then they sell millions and millions of these tickets to these movies, or used to pre-COVID. Now they download at unbelievable rates, right?
Yes.
So over the next few weeks, we're going to share a love story which comes from the pages of the Bible. And we'll see one of the greatest love stories ever told right here in this book of Hosea. So as we come to the first chapter, and we're going to read it together, we're going to be reading from the Message version, again, because we like to read from that one because it takes us out of our more familiar vernacular and puts us in a common language reading of the text. So feel free to look it up on your computer or pull out your Message Bible or pull out your other NRSV or NIV and read along in that way, but it may feel a little different. And then it'll also be at the bottom of the screen as we read it together. Danielle, you want to read it? It's just 11 verses, this first chapter, and we'll go from there.
All right. This is God's message to Hosea, son of Beeri. It came to him during the royal reigns of Judah's kings Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. This was also the time that Jeroboam, son of Joash, was king over Israel. This whole country has become a whorehouse. Is that the title?
That's the
That's
first.
the title of this thing. Okay. So the first time God spoke to Hosea, he said, "Find a whore and marry her. Make this whore the mother of your children, and here's why. This whole country has become a whorehouse, unfaithful to me, God." Hosea did it. He picked Gomer, daughter of Diblaim.
Sounds good to me, yeah.
She got pregnant and gave him a son. Then God told him, "Name him Jezreel. It won't be long now before I'll make the people of Israel pay for the massacre at Jezreel. I'm calling it quits on the kingdom of Israel. Payday is coming. I'm going to chop Israel's bows and arrows into kindling in the valley of Jezreel."
Okay, so let's just pause there for a second.
Yeah.
Right?
This is why God gets a bad rap.
Yeah.
Because of stories like this,
Yeah.
right?
No, totally.
Somebody reads this kind of a story and they're like, "I'm out. I'm not doing anything with this God."
Right. And they don't like prophetic literature is its own thing.
And there's an intensity to it.
There's an intensity to it, and there's an you have to read it as though it's coming from an author that's trying to say something about God that even God might not be wanting said about him. Right? So, like, when we think about genres of literature within the sacred text, prophetic literature is its own thing.
Yeah.
So it's telling this crazy story, and then they're attributing these things to God that might actually be more attributable to empires and that sort of thing around them, but they're trying to understand why the bad things are about to happen.
Yeah.
And so they're like, well, we did bad things, so the good God is cleaning up house.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's just it's a narrative
Yeah.
of that time. It'd be like reading Hamlet and like or any of the Shakespearean plays where everybody gets slaughtered and not trying to read it with understanding of what Shakespeare was saying in the time that he was saying it.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
well, and these prophets are trying to push along a transformational moment. So they're trying to get everyone's
Totally.
attention. And if we think about these stories originally being told to people and then passed along to other people, this would be a powerful story to pass around the fire at night.
right.
Yeah.
You go marry a prostitute from a whorehouse,
Right.
and then she has your first kid, and God tells you to name him after a city where a massacre occurred.
Shocking.
Right?
Yes.
There's a point there.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like
It's not a literal interpretation of how we're to
exactly.
live for God.
right.
But the things that sort of bubble up as a result of this story are literal interpretations of how we're to live for God.
Exactly.
And that there are consequences when we don't live for God. And I don't think people like to hear that.
No, I don't think people like to hear that
Humans
either.
don't like to hear that. I don't like to hear it.
I think we don't love prophetic literature, I think, because it forces us to see ourselves as the bad guy. Right? When we read the Gospels, very
Yeah.
few of us ever read ourselves as the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Right.
We read ourselves as the disciples.
And we don't read ourselves as Israel in these stories either.
Yeah.
We read ourselves as sort of like, oh, see, they didn't get it.
But it's
And-
hard, right? Because here he clearly says, like, why are you to marry a prostitute? Because Israel's a prostitute.
Yeah, yeah,
Why should you marry a prostitute? Because you're a prostitute, and I'm trying to teach you a lesson.
yeah.
Right? It's harder to differentiate oneself within the text.
Which is why I think the fact that we frame this up as a love story matters.
Yes.
Because when you love someone, you are trying to call them back to love, right? And so I think that this is God's way of doing that. This is the prophet's way of saying, this is how much God cares about you. This is how loved you are, that there are deep consequences to this. And we
Yeah.
all know that when it comes to love, right?
Totally. Yeah, there's something like as I was reading this time, and when God says to her, "Go find a whore and marry her," that's part of why I love the message in this version too, because it doesn't mince words, right? Like, go
Yeah.
find a whore and marry her. And then it says that he went and he picked Gomer,
I know.
right? Like, it wasn't like God said, go marry Gomer, go marry this prostitute. It was, go to the whorehouse and find a person you want to marry.
Yeah.
And there was something about Gomer that drew Hosea.
Yeah.
Now, we also have to talk about the contextual reality of why women historically have entered into the engagement of prostitution, right? Because frequently the only commodity that women have to care for themselves throughout history has been their bodies.
Yeah.
Because men have stripped every other piece of
Right.
power.
All
from
their
them.
other rights or education or
Right.
whatever is denied them.
So
yeah.
Gomer could have just been a person who had lost everything, and the only way she could provide for herself was to use her body to provide for herself.
Right.
So we're not making you and I are not making a claim about Gomer's work
Yeah.
in this moment. Like, we don't know her story. It's part of what's left out by it being written by a man.
Well, and frankly, this is a whole other topic that we weren't planning on talking about, but I do think if you begin to study the issue of even sex trafficking and understanding how women get involved in that, sometimes, almost always against their will, but sometimes at their own initiation to begin with, or they take their own initiative, you start to understand the psychology of it, which is a desperate, it's a desperate psychology of, being maybe cut off from your family, cut off from your community, literally not having any other options. Yeah. So
I just want to inject that there so that we're clear about that. This is a very misogynistic text as we enter into it.
because it was written to a very misogynistic culture.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So
May we do
now we
better.
jump back in. Now we've had the first kid, whose name is
No, wait. We
Jezreel.
didn't- Oh, yeah. Yep.
And so now
So
we're
we're
in
at
verse
6.
6.
Mhm. So Gomer got pregnant again. This time she had a daughter. God told Hosea, name this one No Mercy. I'm fed up with Israel. And again, names have a lot of meaning
They
in
have a ton of
Scripture.
meaning.
So,
The
I mean,
fact that
they're...
his name is Salvation.
Right.
Right?
And then the
Hosea
children
salvation.
are now so far No Mercy and named
The
after a
massacre
place where a
city.
massacre. Yeah, exactly. This is a big deal.
Can
So,
you imagine naming your kid No Mercy? That's horrible.
oh my gosh.
Oh, man.
Oh, I've got a lot of things going through my head right now. I've run out of mercy. There's no more forgiveness. Judah's another story. I'll continue having mercy on them. I'll save them. It will be their God who saves them, not their armaments and armies, not their horsepower and manpower. So what's that referring to?
So the tribes have been divided. So now you have north and south, right? You have Israel and you have Judah. And these two kind of divided realities both make up the Hebrew people, but the kingdoms had been separated. So in the prophets, you have prophets that are speaking to different kingdoms.
Yeah.
This one, Hosea is speaking to Israel. And so far, Judah's okay. It's basically like Judah's going to be saved. Israel's the one who's living like a whore.
And he's trying to get them to listen and to say this is not all humans that are,
Right.
I think there is a bit of personal responsibility that Hosea is trying to call them to, or communal responsibility, but also, this is not the word for everyone. This is their personal word.
For a very specific city, yeah.
Yeah. So God's speaking to us in community. I think that's a
Yeah.
interesting thing too. After Gomer had weaned No Mercy, she got pregnant yet again and had a son. God said, name him Nobody. You have become nobodies to me, and I, God, am a nobody to you. But down the road, the population of Israel is going to explode past counting, like sand on the ocean beaches. In the very place where they were once named Nobody, they will be named God's Somebody. Everybody in Judah and everybody in Israel will be assembled as one people. They'll choose a single leader. There'll be no stopping them. A great day in Jezreel.
Right. So this is one of the things I find fascinating about prophetic literature is it follows this system where it's like you have done bad things.
There's no hope for you.
You're
a nobody.
in trouble. You're a nobody. But someday you'll be a somebody.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not leaving you.
Yeah.
I'm not forsaking you. You've left me, right? This is the story. This is how the love story starts, right?
Yeah.
Is like, God didn't leave his people. His people left him to become a prostitute.
Yeah.
And they're gonna live out the consequences of their prostitution.
Mm-hmm. Which is really important to know. I mean, I believe that for us now as the people of God, that there are consequences to our actions. And for whatever reason, I don't think Western theology likes that there are consequences to our action.
Or Western people generally.
Yeah.
Right, I think this is the conversation, like, to bring it into the heart of where we're at right now. I think this is one of the questions about systematic racism. I think people are very uncomfortable
Yeah.
thinking about race as a system of oppression. We want to talk about, like, how are our race relations, right? Like, how are...
Or we want to blame individuals, right? We
Right.
want to say, like, can you believe that guy did that? Or can you believe those people did that? And we kind of place ourselves outside of the story when I think this moment is calling all of us to take our place in the story.
Take our place in the story and realize that, like, part of the story, you know, part of what people are balking against is, right, like, I've had people in my life say, well, I didn't ever have slaves.
Right.
No, but we did for 400 years.
Yeah.
Right? Like, for a long time.
Yeah.
We, as a people, had slaves. And that, in the midst of setting up a country,
Yeah.
right? Setting up an entire nation state, people were oppressed, and we built those systems of oppression into our laws, into our how we favor or disfavor things,
Into our criminal justice
our
system,
population setup, into
our education system.
you know, all of it, right?
Yeah.
It's all there, and it's built in the code.
Yes.
That's part of what's happening here for Gomer too, right? Like, or for Israel. Israel had lived into the level of prostitution, of giving themselves over to other gods and other faiths, to the point where they had lost their own identity so much that the entire empire was going, the city of Israel was going to be destroyed by another empire because they had weakened who they were.
Yeah.
And so part of what, like, this helps us understand is, like, we do have moral responsibility for things even that our ancestry established and created.
Yeah.
Like, our ancestry can't change
Yes.
things. We can.
And, you know, it's interesting. In this sort of world where Brene Brown has taken off, and I love Brene Brown. I mean, I love her.
Me
I
too.
love her
Yeah.
work. I respect her work. But I've read some interesting articles recently that say, nothing actually about her, but, you know, Brene has sort of shed this light on shame.
Yeah.
And that sometimes we can get in these shame spirals that are not helpful to us. And we need to kind of look at that and tend to that. But I've read multiple articles lately that have said, you know, some of what we feel in this racial conversation is shame, and that this shame is good for us when we let it propel us to do better and compel us to do better. So in a way, I feel like this is what Hosea is doing as well. He's sort of trying to say, wake up. I think you're trying to ignore the fallout of how you've been acting and behaving, and just so you know, God's noticed, and God is wanting to bring you back again.
Yeah, and that you can, like, Brene makes a statement about the difference between shame and guilt,
Yeah.
right? And she believes that guilt is good,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because, and, like, we do bear some guilt. Like, it doesn't,
Yes.
like, guilt is not there for us to self-flagellate. It's there for us to fix,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Like, the things that we feel guilty for are things that we need to do the work to bring healing to. That, like...
And that, I would say, is one of the things that differentiates the people of God from other people. Does that make sense? You know, like, I think people that are trying to follow God are doing that work, I hope. Should be doing that work. Maybe I should say it differently. I think as the people of God, we're called to do that work. That's one of the marks of sort of what we're supposed to be doing. I don't know that we're good at doing it, though. And so
Yeah, in fact, I think I often think that we're worse at it than people who don't define themselves as God followers.
because we think we have some get out of jail free card.
Because it's, for us, religion has become about this identity of a salvific force for the life after death.
Yeah.
And so that's where our sphere has lived into its reality with religion.
Yeah.
When I think often people who are not God followers, like all they have is now. Like in their framework, all they have is now. So living an ethical life matters, right? It becomes like, how do I live more ethically? Like my experience of non-followers of God is usually better ethically than Christians.
Isn't that interesting?
And I think, I think part of why I wanted to do this book is because I think we live in a morally deprived moment in history where we have no framework for what it means to live an ethical life any longer.
Yeah.
Our leadership is not living ethically. Our world is chaotic and messy. And we have a moment to do exactly what Hosea is calling Israel to, of doubling down into what it means to be a person of faith and live a ethical way of life that's good for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's the beauty of ethics, is it's good for everyone.
Yes.
Not just for ourselves.
It's tied to community.
And so it's the challenge of this text, right?
And it's why it's painful. I mean, it's asking something of us. This is the thing. I think real faith asks something real from us, and that is counter to what a lot of us have learned for whatever reason.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we think, well, shouldn't faith just be this add-on to my life?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, no, it's not.
Yep.
Well,
Well,
it's quite a
Here
chapter,
we
right?
go.
Like, God calls Israel a whorehouse. The whole country has become a whorehouse. That's a great title.
nobodies who will once again be somebody.
Somebody's. Yeah. So as you go from this place, whatever space you're in, looking at this text, choose to be uncomfortable, right? That's part of what we're really wanting in the next few weeks is let's get uncomfortable for a minute.
Yeah.
And talk about the things that really matter. Have some important conversations over the dinner table with whoever you're sitting around to have dinner with, or over the phone if you don't have somebody to have dinner with. And talk about where we're really at. Where are we at as a church? Where are we at as a nation? Where are we at as a community?
Mm-hmm.
And where is God calling us to be?
And it's okay to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think what I'm trying to say in these days is I don't really know, but I am committed to learning more.
Yeah.
And that's hopefully what this will be for us too. Together, all of us together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So go in peace.